Jo Clarke, welcome to the Man Down podcast. How you doing?
Yeah, really well, thank you. So excited to be here with you.
Yes, and we were just discussing before we went on the air, like you have no idea what I'm going to ask you, so this could be either phenomenal or a disaster. We'll just see how it goes. I'm sure it'll be phenomenal. So, so let me introduce you first, and then we will jump right in. So, Professor Jo Clarke is a chartered psychologist, academic, and international leader in the field of well-being and resilience. Just that right there puts my community college education into context. She is the founder and director of Petros, a not for profit organization specializing in psychological health and performance in high pressure environments. Jo has spent over 2 decades working inside the British prison system, where she pioneered trauma informed approaches long before they became mainstream. Her work blends rigorous academic research with real world application, earning her a reputation for developing practical, evidence based solutions that create lasting change. A compelling keynote speaker and trusted advisor to public and private sector organizations, Jo's passion lies in equipping people not just to cope, but to thrive. Over the last 3 years, Jo journeyed alongside her foster daughter of 8 years, Hope, as she navigated what proved to be fatal cancer. Hope died last May, aged 22 years. Alongside this, Jo has been supporting her mom after a diagnosis of Alzheimer's on the same day as her daughter's cancer diagnosis. That's a Wow. Both experiences have seriously challenged everything she knows about resilience. The great thing is her knowledge and practice withstood the tests of life. So, first of all, welcome again. And what is it like to hear your bio like read like that when you have to sit there and listen to it? I always find it kind of awkward, but
Yeah, well, the first part makes me go, oh, God. I think AI wrote some of that. And the second part just made me want to cry, actually. So hearing it read, that's, it's just, well, we're still living it. It's only been 6 months. So it's not been long since Hope died. And grief, as you know, is a very strange companion.
absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'd love to talk about hope in a lot of detail because obviously we've talked about it over the past number of months since we've gotten to know each other. But I'd love to start with your backstory in the sense of how did you like? I'd love for you to talk about your time, like how you ended up working in the British prison system and what you saw and learned there, and how that influenced where you took the rest of your academic and professional career.
Yeah, well, it's really interesting reflecting on that journey into the prison system because initially there was an advertisement for psychologists in prisons when I was 23. And I remember reading it and thinking, oh, that sounds fascinating, but I think I'm a bit young. And now when I look back, I clearly had a really clear understanding of the potential impact of work on our well-being. Even at the time, that wasn't how I framed it. So I actually ended up working with offenders in the community. I hadn't had a drive to work with offenders. I also applied for jobs to work for the Jockey Club and do a PhD in horse behaviour. You know how it is when you're just starting out, you don't really know what you're going to do. Anyway, I ended up 2 years later applying to work in prisons and was posted to a tiny island off the south of England called the Isle of Wight, where they had three prisons. Makes me feel a bit sorry for the islanders.
Wow.
So at that point, there were three prisons, two high security and a lower security prison, and that's where I started my career. So it was fascinating there.
Is that like Alcatraz? Like take these, just get them on an island and off the mainland? Is that how they end up with three prisons there?
I don't know. But one of them's really famous actually, Parkhurst Prison. I mean, it's not there anymore. The three prisons have been amassed into one prison called HMP Isle of Wight. But Parkhurst was very famous in the UK and probably around the world. But yeah, I think it's keeping people with a bit of water between the prisons and the mainland.
Yeah, and I'd love for you to, if you could talk about, what you saw in there related to, childhood trauma, like the highest risk of, the worst of the worst, or that's probably not the best way
Yeah,
to put it, called the highest risk offenders.
yeah.
What you saw related to childhood trauma and what you noticed about, how some people were, seemed to be more resilient than others.
In terms of surviving in prison or
Yeah.
amongst the staff,
Well, I guess, yeah. I mean, whatever you think makes the most sense.
both. Well, it is really interesting about childhood trauma because bearing in mind I was working there in the 1990s, so most of the men that I was working with at that point had grown up through the 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and then here they were in prison. And I have to say, throughout my whole prison career, I have not met a really high risk offender who hasn't had serious trauma in their childhood. I've met plenty of offenders who don't have trauma in their childhood, but amongst the highest risk, most dangerous, most damaged men in the prison system in England and Wales, at least, every single one of them had significant trauma. And I can talk to some of those cases, and I think I will mention one just because so often people with no experience of prison or prisoners will say, well, they just kind of need to get over it, don't they? They're adults now, they should find their way. And I think for some of them, that's absolutely right. But there was a man who I didn't actually know. I was just writing a report based on all the assessments and documentation. His offence was hideous. He murdered a teenager. I won't go into detail. You're reading it though and thinking, oh, good grief. And then and then you read all the reports from his childhood. And this was a man who, at the age of 4, was found by social services in a back garden in the pouring rain, tied up to the washing line by a dog collar around his neck, age 4, freezing and malnourished. And he was taken into care and then systematically abused in care. And I read this and thought, how on earth do we expect someone like him to grow up pro social and able to manage the challenges and pressures of just daily living? I mean, he really didn't stand a chance. It's not at all surprising he ended up where he ended up. And I think he probably himself would have felt safer in prison than anywhere else. I don't think people necessarily set out to want to damage and harm people and kill them. But something inside isn't working, probably in those cases, largely because their brains have been so badly impacted through childhood trauma that they're not functioning like the rest of us. That's terrible. Yeah,
God, it just
yeah.
it makes me. I mean, how do you think about this? Is sort of a maybe a bit of a tangent, but how do you think of the idea of blame and responsibility? Because if you look at somebody like that, right, you can think,
Yeah,
okay, well, we to function as a society,
yeah,
people need to be accountable for the actions and the consequences of their actions. But at the same time, like I think sometimes when something terrible happens, we just naturally look for someone to blame. And I think like I think about this a lot. I've thought about this a lot with my daughter, right? And I know we've talked about this, but she died in a horrible way, drinking and driving. She killed herself. She almost killed 4 other people. Like just horrific, right? And I think I totally understand if the people who were in the other car think of her as some kind of monster and they blame her. Like I get it, and I remember talking to a therapist one time just about this and him saying like, talking about the idea of responsibility, but because when you think about blame, because blame is when you start thinking about blame, you start moving from rehabilitation, let's say, to almost to a punitive model,
yeah,
kind of like they do in the States, I think mostly.
yeah,
But he said when you think of blame, like, okay, yes, clearly your daughter has some blame, but her mother killed herself. They traumatized her as a kid, and her mother killed, like, you know, allowed her to be sexually abused and all that, like all going through these generations. So he goes, all of a sudden it becomes so big that blame becomes almost like a pointless exercise. Like,
yeah.
and so, but anyways, I'm curious about your thoughts about it.
And I think with the men I work with in prison, in a sense, this is going to sound a bit strange, but I think it would do them a disservice to not hold them accountable for their behaviour. Because when you say, "Oh, poor you," you couldn't help it, then what chance do they have of making amends, of rectifying their behaviour, of learning new strategies to not be dangerous? So I do think it's really important to have a context where you might understand and history might explain and help you make sense of how they ended up where they were. I think that's really important. And I absolutely understand when somebody is very close to the damage that they've caused, of course, you're going to blame them. What else are you going to do? And you're not going to be thinking, if I was the victim's mother, I'm not going to be thinking about that offender's childhood and the way he was let down by the system and the fact that he was really badly abused by so many people. That's not going to be on my mind. I'm just going to want, probably even want my revenge for the harm he caused to my child. But as a professional, your job is to try and understand the wider picture, is to try and understand the wider context. You don't have that emotional involvement in the case that somebody who's been victimised by them would have. So I think it's really important to understand and try and make sense of the things that might put somebody on that kind of path. I also think, and this just has come to me while we were talking, I think we feel in the time that we're living that there's so much more knowledge and understanding and exchange of communication and information, and then we hear about something dreadful and tragic, and feel like that's, life's really hard. But actually, I think it's really hard for everyone a lot of the time. I don't think, you know, very much. Obviously, the murders and the men who committed murder that I work with slightly different, but in day-to-day terms of people being traumatized, people trying to manage really difficult experiences and the impact that has on their life as they grow up. I think we'd be hard pushed to find somebody who hadn't been really badly impacted. And in that case, blame is absolutely pointless, because we just all be blaming each other all of the time for everything. I haven't met anyone who hasn't had a trauma.
Yeah, no, that makes sense to me. So when you're in prison, you're in this environment, and I can imagine what that was like for. I mean, I would love to hear, just from the perspective of somebody who's 23, to be thrust into such a foreign, let's say, environment. But while you're in there, you notice that people have varying capacities to overcome, and move forward from the trauma they've experienced, which I think led you to become interested in resilience. So I'd love to hear maybe those two things: is what was it like to walk into that environment, and then your path on becoming curious about and wanting to learn about resilience.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, prison's an overwhelming environment, and I mean, I've not been in it directly for the last sort of 12 years. I still do work for prisons, but I don't spend my daily life, my professional life, in prison. And I think it's very different now from the way it was back in the 90s and noughties. They're very harsh. The physical environment's awful. There's a massive difference between a high security prison and a local prison. So I started off in a high security prison where very few prisoners are wandering around on their own at any time. Mostly they're escorted by staff. It's very controlled. Actually felt like a very safe environment in a sense. I probably felt safer there than I would have done walking down a street I didn't know at night on my own, because I knew the men I was working with. There were staff everywhere. I had mostly a pretty good relationship with the staff, so that was fine. And then I moved to Brixton Prison in London, which is what we call a local prison, so where men are held on remand before they're sentenced. And I remember walking onto one of the residential wings and just being mobbed by about 80 men, because they're all fascinated by this woman who just walked onto the unit. And because it's not maximum security, there's nowhere near the level of control. So that, you really have to find your inner core of strength to go, I really want to run in the other direction, but I'm here as a professional. And I got very used to that in the end, and actually really enjoyed both places. They were just very different, but they put an enormous strain on staff and prisoners, actually. But to work in those environments, to go in, day out, and like we're in the depths of our winter now. So if I was working in a prison, I'd be turning up to work in the dark. I'd be going home in the dark. I'd be in a very grey, harsh, loud, concrete environment for most of the day, surrounded by an enormous amount of pressure. And because of my job as a psychologist, reading details, hearing details of offences, of offender zone victimisation, you take in an enormous amount of information, most of it really distressing. And what happened in terms of my interest in resilience was when two of my colleagues who I'd worked with on the Isle of Wight took the prison service to court for psychiatric injury. And they described feeling incredibly damaged by this exposure to that level of detail. And what interested me was that if it was purely the work, if it was the content of the work, then all of us would have been having the same experience, surely. So there had to be something else about how you thrive or not, or barely survive, when you're immersed in that world. They're very antisocial, potentially very dangerous. murky world. So what is it that allows some people to thrive and other people to barely survive it? And that's what I wanted to do my PhD in. So I did that in 2000 at the University of York for about 3 years, and then went back into the prison system to apply all the findings. And since then, my focus has always been on how can we ensure, to the best of our ability in work terms, that people have the conditions to thrive no matter what their work. And you could be in high pressure finance, for example, or you might be working with children in social services, or you might be working in prisons, or you might be working in health. How does the organisation and the individual work together to allow thriving? And that's what I do now. That's what I spend all my days thinking about. So, yeah, and that's how I got there. So, yeah.
What's the connection between that thriving that you mentioned and resilience? Like, are those concepts are they related at all in your mind?
Well, for me, they're pretty similar, but I think it's interesting that resilience is a term from engineering. It's not a psychological term, and so it's been. I don't. Anyone who's interested in the history of language, I just thought it was really fascinating. It's the term's been around for about 500 years. It refers to the amount of pressure that a material can take, and then still reform to its original shape once the pressure's been removed. So there's that concept of kind of like bouncing back, and psychologists decided, I think, about in the 1970s, this is a good term to apply for people, their ability to bounce back. But actually, still, 50 years later, can't really agree on a definition. And, question whether or not resilience is genetic or learned or only happens as a result of exposure to adversity. And I think it's probably all those things. So that there's certainly research that suggests there's a genetic component. About 30% of people are born naturally resilient. There certainly is evidence that people can be taught the skills. So when we relate that to thriving, it's as if, what do you need to thrive? You need to be able to navigate the complexities of life. You need to be able to solve problems well, control your impulses well, think consequentially, work out, if I take this action, what might the consequences of that be? I need to think about other people's perspectives. And these are all, we term them as a group, executive function skills. What's really interesting in the concept of trauma is that we know the brain is changed by exposure to trauma. And sometimes the way those executive function skills develop or are used is different in people who've been traumatized. So that's really fascinating. So for me, people who thrive can access those skills, can use those skills, can put them to good use. And I would say resilience for me is about skills. It's not about strength. I really, really struggle with the idea that people say, resilient people are just really strong, because that means that if you're not resilient, you're really weak. And that's very insulting in my view. So I think for me, resilience is about having the skills. And if you're not resilient, you haven't had an opportunity to learn those skills. Perhaps nobody in your upbringing encouraged those sorts of skills, thinking about other people, solving problems, managing your emotion. Lots of people aren't taught those things. And then if they're traumatized on top of that, the chances are their brain doesn't develop in a way that encourages the development of those skills. That sounds terribly technical.
No, that was no. I love it. One thing that I wanted to ask you about actually is, talking about the origin of the word being from engineering and how much pressure, force, a material can take and still reform to its original shape. And I have always kind of thought about resilience, about really being the positive adaptation to a challenge. So rather than just necessarily returning to like your original state before the challenge, actually growing and becoming different. I mean, how do you think about it?
No, I absolutely agree. And both in terms of resilience, when you face adversity, as a psychologist called Michael Rutter, I think his name is, who said, actually, we never really know how resilient we are until we face adversity and we put those skills to the test. And then we probably do grow and develop. We'll do things that work well for us during adversity, and I'll do things that don't work so well. And then we might go, I'm not doing that again. If I'm ever faced with this similar situation, I need to do something a bit different. So that's the learning and the growth. And that's also true of exposure to trauma. So I think it might be helpful to make a definition, not a definition, but just look at trauma versus adversity.
Yeah, right.
Because, and you've got me thinking on the spot here because I haven't really done this, but I'm thinking about people listening and say, well, what's the difference between adversity? So I think day-to-day adversity is things like the traffic jam stopping you getting to your job interview, or the train breaking down, or working out how you're going to, find the resources to pay your bills. These are big adversities that lots of people are facing. Trauma, on the other hand, I think is something that is so emotionally overwhelming. So like a loss, well, in fact, there's a definition, isn't there, in the DSM, which is the way we diagnose trauma. I can't remember what version we're on now because it gets updated
Like
quite
6 or
regularly.
something, 5 or 6.
Yeah, it might be 6. In there, I understand the definition of a trauma is something that is threatening to your life or physical integrity, or that you witness something that is threatening to your life or physical integrity, or in the context of work, you're exposed to threats to life or physical integrity. So, me not getting the job I wanted, or having a major fallout with my friend, probably wouldn't be classified as something that might result in post-traumatic stress. It would have to be something around threatening life or safety. But also, and the thing about that is it's overwhelming. It's because we don't experience these things, thank goodness, all the time. When we experience that, for example, loss in the major and the way of that loss, we don't have the resources or the skills to cope with that because we've never experienced it before. The loss of hope. I have never been alongside someone through their cancer journey and to their death. And I was with her when she died. I've never been with anyone when she died. I'd never seen a dead body. So that's a whole new experience that I've never had to test any skills for. I'm pleased is the wrong word, but I'm relieved that a lot of the skills that I've learned did really, really help get me through that without me completely losing my balance. But I still have days where it's hard to keep my balance. So I think that trauma generally is that exposure to something very novel, that we've not tested those skills for. Whereas adversity day to day, we're all facing it all of the time. I mean, even the weather being bad can feel like adversity sometimes. If you're a farmer, bad weather is a real adversity. If you're a dog owner, it can be a bit of a pain if you've got to take your dog out for a walk. But so there's also that level of what it means to the individual.
Yeah. Well, so you mentioned that, I think you said people are born. I think you said 30% of people are
The
born.
research suggests, yeah.
Yeah, like more resilient. So I'm curious about, for those people, like people that are more naturally resilient, what characteristics do they exhibit that allows someone to, like a researcher, to look at them and say, yeah, they're resilient, I guess. And then number two is your level of resilience, whether it's natural or learned,
Mm.
could that, so could a less resilient person experience something as trauma where a more resilient person would experience it as adversity?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Well, to answer the first bit, the research I was referring to was done by a woman called Deborah Werner and her colleagues. So Werner is Werner, if anyone wants to go and look at it. And they were, I'm probably going to really mash up what they did, but they basically studied from, I think, the 60s, about 600 babies that were born into adverse childhood circumstances. So poverty, mental ill health, parental criminality, substance abuse and addiction, and it was based on Hawaii, and they followed these babies up for 50 years, I think. Maybe I think it might only recently have come to an end, actually. And what they found when the babies were in their sort of 30s, there was about a third of the cohort were just thriving. They had good jobs, they were in stable relationships, they were just doing really well despite all those early adverse circumstances. So when the researchers went back and tried to look at how those people differed as babies, there was something temperamental and characterological about them, that they were able to kind of secure the really good care from a stable caregiver, whether that might have been a parent, but it might have been a teacher or another family relative or a family friend. And there was something about their characters, maybe more stable, easygoing, relaxed characters. So, and the researchers concluded that that had to be a genetic thing. It wasn't something that they could have learned because they were tiny, tiny babies. So I think that ability to form relationship is really crucial to thriving as well. We need each other, and we're living in an increasingly isolated world, which is really sad. And so I think that that was what they noticed about these babies. And I can't remember the difference between levels of resilience. Well, I think probably, and I don't know what other psychologists would say about this, but think about the resources you have to respond to adversity. And in addition to any genetic predisposition you might have, there will also be, whatever your current circumstances are, and we need to think. I really like the work of Jim Lowe and Tony Schwartz, actually, who are sports psychologists, but they talk about energy, they talk about managing your energy, and they talk about energy in four domains: so physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. So there will be days when I am much more physically energized and emotionally energized to manage what life throws at me, whatever that might be. So there'll be some days when I'm stuck in traffic and it's just like, oh, whatever. And there'll be other days when I'll be, for God's sake, will everyone just move and stop driving like idiots? So, and that will be influenced by, how did I sleep well? Have I eaten well? Am I exercising well? Have I got a good network around me? Am I well supported? Am I mentally challenged and stimulated in a good way? Is my brain working well? And does my life have meaning? And all of those resources will help me navigate whatever life throws at me. But if I'm depleting those resources, if I'm not sleeping well, maybe I've got a tiny baby at home and I'm not sleeping well and I'm worried about my partner whose job is under threat and my parents are poorly and all those sorts of things. And it takes those mental resources and those emotional resources so that when you're then faced with the next thing, it just all feels like too much. And so the sum of resilience for me is about how do you stay alert and awake to your needs in order that you can respond well, you can respond adaptively to what life throws at you. So through my foster daughter's cancer journey, I was very mindful of eating well, trying to get some decent sleep, balancing the demands of my work, which I was really lucky to do because I work for myself. So I could give up a day's work if I was needed to. Trying to organise my time in a way that meant I could be with her at hospital appointments, so I didn't have to manage all the guilt about not being with her. Um, and because of what I do for a living, I guess I was just really mindful of that for the whole 2.5 years. And I think, and this is another thing that I think really causes people to struggle and suffer, is that our minds are phenomenal. We are incredible storytellers, human beings. And this is why we probably are at the top of the food chain, because we can tell stories. But our minds tell stories all the time, and we have a tendency to negativity. So it would be very easy to have gone over and over and over the worst case scenario about my foster daughter. And I'm so grateful for the training and the skills that I've got, which help me know whether or not what's going on in my mind is a made up story or what's reality. So I was able to stop those stories really quickly and also help her stop those stories. So I could give you an example if that might be helpful.
Yeah, well, actually, what I was going to ask you, and maybe this is actually, maybe this is a perfect, what you're about to say is perfect, but I was going to ask you if, in that journey of, that horrific journey of watching Hope pass away, um, if there's any particular moments that stand out to you where you noticed and said, okay, wow, that, like, I'm handling this way because I have these skills.
Yeah, there are a few of them. I mean, when she was ill, when she first got ill, and we didn't know what it was. I didn't imagine it was cancer. I didn't imagine it was anything. I just said you really need to get to the doctor, and and she didn't because she was really stubborn. She was nursing. She's in the third year of her nursing degree, and she was on placement. It was January. She'd ring me on her way home from placement with this hacking cough. And I'm like, Hope, please go and get that looked at. And one of her consultants on her placement said, go and get a scan. And she went down there after a shift. She was really tired, and there was a really long queue, so she went home. So I was like, ugh. And what happened was I woke up one morning to a text message from her saying, I've cancelled the ambulance, which baffled me. And I rang her straight away and said, what do you mean you've cancelled the ambulance? And she said, oh, during the night, I had so much pain that I rang. We have a service called 111 where you can ring and get some advice. And they were really worried about her symptoms, so they sent an ambulance for her. But then the pain went away, so she cancelled it. And I just said to her, Hope, get in a taxi now. I'll pay for it, but you get yourself to hospital. She was a good sort of 2-hour drive from me. Get yourself to hospital. We need to get this sorted out. It's been going on for too long. And that was it. I didn't then spend the rest of the day going, oh my God, what's wrong? What's happening? Is she okay? Is it something awful? Is it nothing? I just knew that I had no information about what it was. So anything else going on in my head was make-believe. It was a story. Anyway, as she was scanned, she had a mass, and she was sent to a specialist hospital that day and spent a week in hospital up there. But what my training, I guess, has allowed me to do is just work with what we know and to not make up anything else. So that would be one example. But the one that I want to share that I think, because she could do this too, it's testament to her. I run a training program called The Challenge of Change. It was written by my PhD supervisor, and it's about how to manage your mind. And he's written a book called Work Without Stress. I think it should be called Live Without Stress. But so if anyone's interested and wants to know more, the book Work Without Stress is well worth a read. But so he wrote this training program based on this book, and Hope undertook that training soon after she first became ill. And it's very much about not letting your mind run away with you. And we came back from her first chemo, or maybe it was second chemo. So she would have chemo for a week and then 3 weeks off, and then chemo for a week and 3 weeks off. And she'd come back from chemo, and I got up to her room, and she was sobbing. And she was saying to me, Jo, I can't do another chemo. It's too hard. It's too difficult. And what I said to her, because she'd done the training, she understood this. I said, listen, lovely, I used to call her Hey Hey after the chicken in Moana. So listen, Hey Hey. Right now, you're not in chemo. Right now, you're in your bedroom in your home with your dog and your family, and we're all here. And we've got everything we need. You are not in the hospital having chemo. Because in her head, she was 3 weeks away in chemo. And she could have spent that 3 weeks imagining she was back in chemo. Can you imagine how awful that would be? In your mind, you're in chemo, even though you're physically not there. So one key skill to not getting overwhelmed by what's going on is managing the stories in your head. You can't always stop them because they're really powerful, but you can decide whether or not you pay attention to them. So on a lighter note, maybe my other daughter's maybe gone on a train journey and she hasn't phoned me to say she's arrived. And in my head, I go, oh my God, is she all right? Is everything okay? Has she got there okay? Has anything happened? But I'm going, okay, I hear you, but do shut up. Because I'm sure she's fine. And eventually she'll ring me. So, and then you give your attention to something that you're doing in the moment, whatever that is.
I think I love that, because I think that's one thing that people don't understand about the way our minds function, is that we, as human beings, we hate an incomplete picture in our minds. And so when we have gaps in our knowledge, like if somebody doesn't call you when they're supposed to, you don't know why they didn't call you. So what do? You don't like this incomplete picture, so you make up a story to close the gap. And we don't realize we're doing it. It's like it's just a natural part of our way of making, like, interacting with the world and making meaning. And so when people realize that your brains are story manufacturing machines, and you actually have, to your point, you have choices as to whether you listen to it, but also you have choices with practice about being able to tell yourself better stories in the moment.
That's so true. But the stories in our head, because they're in our head, they're so compelling. It's like they must be true because they're in our head.
So, I always tell
discipline.
people. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No. I was just going to say it's a discipline to manage the stories in your head. Yeah.
I always tell people, like, if you leave something in your head, you can literally make anything make sense. But if you're not sure if something you're doing is a good idea, say it out loud in the form of a sentence. And if it sounds totally stupid, it probably is. You know?
Brilliant advice. Brilliant advice. And also
So,
writing things down, the story in your head, write it down. It, as a stream of consciousness, no worries about grammar or spelling. This is the research of a chap called James Pennybaker, who actually pioneered this technique called trauma disclosure. He now, I think, refers to it as written disclosure. But it's just writing what's in your head on a piece of paper. And once it's out of your head and on that piece of paper, you've got a much better objective oversight of what's going on. And usually, as you say, oh, actually, that doesn't sound nearly as bad. Now it's written down, or now I've spoken it out loud. That's a really good technique.
I've heard that called expressive writing too. Is that the same thing?
I think it's very similar. Yeah.
Okay.
The key thing is you don't censor it. No one else is going to see it. So you literally write a stream of consciousness. No worry about spelling or grammar or anything like that. You just write. It's very cathartic. It's lovely. Do it myself from time to time.
So, I mean, this podcast is called Man Down. Obviously it's really targeted towards grief and growth and resilience for men and the people who love them. And I think of a man who, let's say, has suffered a devastating loss, right? And so obviously we want to be resilient, but I wonder, and I'm really interested in your point of view about this. I wonder if resilience has almost become a buzzword, or the way we talk about it actually keeps people stuck, because I wonder sometimes when people don't know what resilience is, or whether sometimes like we weaponize the word, that we really misinterpret resilience as pretend you're fine. So I guess I'm curious about what would you say is the most dangerous misunderstanding about resilience that you see?
But it's strength, because it isn't. Anyone who thinks that they can cope with that level of grief on their own, or do everything all by themselves, never ask for help, never stop and rest. The number of people I see who think that success and strength and resilience is powering through at whatever cost. And of course, everyone breaks down. They burn out. They take to alcohol or drugs or whatever to get through. And that to me is not what resilience is. They get angry with their partners. They have road rage. There's this so much pent up emotion because people think resilience is being strong. And just for me, that is not the case. Resilience is about skills. So I think, though, it's not quite that simple, is it? Because I think culturally, men are grown up to believe they should never express a feeling, except maybe anger. And certainly this is my experience in prison. And quite a few of the men that I worked with in prison didn't know what to do with their feelings. So it came out as violence, which is tragic for everybody. But there's so much shame for men tied up in having a feeling that isn't an angry feeling, that somehow it feminizes them. Whereas emotions don't have a gender. Emotions are emotions. But because women are more able to cry, and we tend to feel less embarrassed, I don't necessarily count myself amongst those. Still don't like crying in front of people, but we're more likely to cry. We're more likely to talk about how we're feeling. We're more likely to reach out and ask for help. It means we're less likely, to end up committing violent crime. So I can't remember what the percentages are, but there's a tiny proportion of women in prisons compared with men. And not saying, that all men are in prison because they haven't managed their emotions well, but there certainly would be an element of that. So I agree with you about the term resilience. I said maybe that's why I'm using the word thriving more. I think it's easier to understand thriving. If you look at a field of crops, you know whether the crops are thriving or not. You don't need to be an expert in plants. Everything's green and lush and lovely and as it should be. And if you look at a field of crops, it's plagued and devastated by drought or something. You can tell the difference between something that's thriving and something that isn't.
Yeah.
So I agree. I think the term resilience has been weaponized, and I think it's very unhelpful.
Yeah, man, me too. Well, so you spent like your career helping people cope in high pressure environments. And one of the things I'm noticing, like I notice this with myself, but as I become more self aware, I maybe it's just confirmation bias, but I notice it everywhere else too. But in like I think our systems, like the way that we operate, they almost reward dysregulation, like, adrenaline and urgency and control and like dopamine hit and like the next goal challenge, blah blah blah. And I guess like, and maybe you don't see it this way, but my question really is, how do you help people build resilience inside systems that almost seem designed to like deplete it?
I think we need a massive reframe, and I think probably the younger generation are going to provide it to us, because we've got a younger generation who are far less likely to drive themselves into the ground than previous generations, and they're far more likely to ask organisations what's in place to look after their psychological well-being. So I think it will change. But I think the reframe is that asking for help, and um, I'm thinking of policing at this point, that asking for help becomes the professional response to a psychological struggle. Just as a bit of an aside, I don't know if you've come across the author Charlie Mackesy. He's a British
No.
author who wrote a book called The Horse, the Boy, the Fox and the Mole. Essentially it's a kid's book, but I absolutely love it. Beautiful illustrations, really worth a buy. I gave it to I gave it to everyone for Christmas one year, and it's full of kind of life affirming quotes. And one of the things, it's just the story of these four characters on a journey, but on one of the pages it says, "Asking for help isn't giving up," said the horse to the boy. "It's refusing to give up."
Mm.
And I thought, wow, actually, if we could reframe the idea that asking for help is courage and determination and grit and all those things that help us navigate adversity, wouldn't that be amazing? And if we could, it's not just men as well. I mean, women in high powered jobs too, they don't want to ask for help. They don't want to look like they're vulnerable. They don't want to be seen to be falling behind or failing or to not know something. It so undermines our sense of confidence and self-worth and everything else. But wouldn't it be amazing if an organisation actually penalised you for not asking for help, for struggling on, and went, no, 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 that's not how we do things around here. We want everybody thriving. We want an organisational culture where, there's levels of stoicism and grit and all those things that help us keep going, but within a framework of support and help and honesty and transparency and vulnerability. And so many of those things that men particularly are told they must never show or be. So we have a definition in my business for resilience. We say it's the ability to respond adaptively to adversity. And now sometimes that might mean soldiering on. Winston Churchill, our famous Prime Minister, was known to say, if you're going through hell, keep going. You don't want to hang around in there. So sometimes soldiering on is the right thing to do, but sometimes stopping is the right thing to do. And I remember when earlier this year, when Hope became more ill and her chemo was stopped, and we knew that it was then just a matter of time before this cancer took her, I stopped work. Now, I was lucky that I really understand. I was in a very lucky position to do this, and I've got a fantastic team of people around me. But I knew I couldn't carry on working. I couldn't be away from home because my mind would not be on the job. My mind would be with her, always thinking, how is she? Does she need anything? What if we need to get to hospital quickly? That kind of thing. And so I had to stop. Now, that was not an easy decision. My whole sense of being is around what I do for a living. So giving that up for essentially 3 months was really had a really interesting impact on my identity. But I knew I had to do it. So sometimes stopping, and it might not be stopping for 3 months. It could be stopping to say, do you know what, today I'm not functioning well. I'm not well resourced. I need to stop and refuel. That is a resilient response to me. Sometimes the resilient response is having a damn good cry. And this is, I think, where I so agree with you that the term's been weaponized. It's like resilient people don't have feelings. They don't express an emotion. Well, that's rubbish. As we've already said, feeling emotions are emotions. We all have them. Our skill is in how we manage them. And sometimes having a good cry is absolutely the best thing to do. It's so cathartic, releases all sorts of chemicals for us we're designed to cry, but culturally we somehow stomp down on that. Men better not do it, especially, which is just dreadful, absolutely dreadful. It's like saying don't laugh if something's funny. Could we? Wouldn't that be awful? Well, laughing is a behavioural response. Crying is a behavioural response. So sometimes the resilient response is to cry. Sometimes it's to ask for help. Sometimes it's to say no. And the number of people I know have huge difficulty saying no is phenomenal. But it leads to all sorts of emotional mess. Our inability to say no, to maintain our boundaries. Anyway, so you've got me going now, Jason.
No, that's great. Well, I think on the crying part, I think what, like, at least my experience is I will, when I need to cry, I will allow myself to cry, but I absolutely cannot. I hate it. I like, and the reason I hate it is because I shouldn't say I hate it. It's extremely uncomfortable for me because there's always this narrative in my head. Like, so let's say, for example, my daughter's urn is like literally right beside me here. And there's times where I'll come downstairs and grab it and clutch it to my chest and just bawl my head off. It doesn't happen that often, but it definitely happens. And when I'm in some of those moments, there's this very strong narrative in my head saying, you are weak. You could not protect your family in this situation. Like, probably some of that is social, probably some of that is biological. I don't know, but I've learned not to listen to that hateful voice, but it's there. And maybe one day I'll get to the point where that voice will go away, but today is not that day. Let me put it that way.
So probably the crying is so associated with such angry self-talk, such an angry story, that it makes crying really uncomfortable. But there are other reasons I find crying really uncomfortable as well, actually. It's like, what are people thinking of me? Why am I crying? I look ugly when I cry. Just ridiculous things, even when you're on your own.
I know.
Terrible.
I'll be crying in the bathtub going, God, if anybody could see this right now, I'd look like a freak, man.
But what I'd say, and because I bet there are people listening who so resonate with what you've said, and in particular the narrative in your head about not being able to protect your family. And going back to what I was saying about the stories in our head, and that they're actually really hard to stop because they're very powerful. I would never challenge, particularly never, but I wouldn't necessarily challenge a negative voice in my head, but I might balance it with something nicer or kinder or more gentle. So, I might say, I couldn't protect my daughter, but I'm doing a really good job at making some serious changes to make things better. So I would always encourage therapeutically when people are telling me about the negative things in their head, I'm no good at this. And I am good at this. And because it rewires your network as well. While we're taking that negative route in our brain, as we know, that lovely expression, neurons that fire together, wire together. And so rerouting the electrical systems takes a bit of effort, but it's absolutely doable. And if we can get into the habit of, if we get something negative in our head, it's just counteracting it with something a bit nicer, kinder, more positive. That can be a really helpful start to being kinder to ourselves. Because now when I cry or something happens that sets me off, or I don't feel like it, I'm just like, well, it's not really surprising given everything that's been going on. You're allowed to feel like this. It's okay. And I literally say that to myself. I'm ever so, I'm very compassionate. Sometimes I have to give myself a good talking to. And that's also necessary. It's like, get on with it, woman. Enough of this. Particularly when I've been on social media for too long. I have to have a sharp word with myself.
Right.
But yeah. So, yeah.
I think on kind of following up from that idea, I guess, in Western culture, we're taught this like rugged individualism, like sometimes it's easy to feel like an army of one. I am responsible for my, blah, blah, blah. And I think with a lot of the resilient sort of, resilience in the context of the self-help world. They frame it in terms of like grit and toughness and self-management, etc. But like I think your work off points to the importance of connection, interdependence, and vulnerability. So I'd love to hear what your take is on just the idea that true resilience is relational rather than
Oh, I no one can survive on their own. We can't do it. And why we think we can, I don't know. But culturally, we're more and more individualists. We're more and more isolated. Our communications are like this. I mean, this would be so different if we were sat in a room together. It would be amazing. We've just had our my business's annual meeting, and we're really lucky to have about 10 people on the team actually come to the house. And it was like magical. The energy was completely different. And obviously some of this is pandemic, post pandemic, but we were heading this way anyway, I think. And I think we need to make a very, very conscious decision to keep our connections live and real because we cannot survive on our own. We're, it's not like saying we're quite hurt. Well, we are tribe animals, aren't we? We used to live
sure.
in tribes. And certainly in recent years, I am more and more um, enthusiastic about the idea of living in a community in my old age, living with loads of people. I don't want to be on my own.
Yeah.
I don't mind it from time to time, but my network is so integral to my well-being. And I notice when I run out of emotional energy, the thing I want to do is be with my friends and my family. And I think, what do I think? I think sometimes we're just not allowed that, and it can be hard to create. And this idea, particularly for men, that they should be able to cope and manage everything by themselves prevents that. But some of the happiest men I know are the ones who've got really close friends. And I don't actually know that many men who have a good network of close friends.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you actually is, like when you think about, like, say you think of a man who's maybe suffered a devastating loss or facing some huge adversity,
Mm.
and conceptually the idea of you can't do this alone, be more vulnerable, talk about your feelings, sound like it makes sense logically, but I can imagine a guy, and I can imagine an earlier version of myself going, who the fuck am I going to talk to about this stuff? My buddies are basically idiots. Like they're nice guys, but we talk about sports and
Yeah.
women, and then we like, my I don't know, like it's what would you say to someone who they're in this situation and they believe they don't have like any kind of support system that will actually even be helpful?
Well, on the basis there's no such thing as original thought, if you're thinking, oh my God, I can't talk to anyone because they won't get it and they won't understand, then everyone else is thinking that too. And actually, everybody needs somebody to reach out. And I know there is a real push. I don't know what it's like in Canada, but here, we've got things like Mates in Mind and Andy's Man Club, and it's all about men creating community together to provide that support to each other, recognizing actually it's impossible to do this on your own, because when you do, it leads to some really maladaptive coping strategies, like
Mm.
drinking and drugs and porn and all the other things that somebody might do to try and ignore or deny how they're feeling. Whereas a much more adaptive response is to talk. So if you're feeling like, if one man is feeling that way about his mates, the chances are his mates are feeling the same way. And if just one of them had the courage to say, "Fuck, I'm struggling," I would be so surprised if they didn't get, "So am I. What's going on for you?" You know.
Mm.
But taking that first step is so hard, and the chances are, sometimes you might not get the response you need, and you only need one person to respond badly to never want to try it again. Um, I The one thing you can guarantee, of course, is if you talk to a professional, you're going to get a more measured, informed response to your distress. So if a man rang up and said, or got in touch and said, I need some coaching or some counselling, whatever you want to call it, I'm not going to say, oh, for goodness sake, pull yourself together, man up. That's not what you're going to get. You're going to get, tell me more. What's going on for you? And I've worked with so many men corporately in the last 5 years or so who have taken that step, and I don't think one of them's regretted it.
Yeah,
Not
and
one.
I think too part of it is communicating with people, like with like men in this case, about what you can expect when you open, what you might expect when you open up, so you're ready for it, and you have a way of navigating. Like, so for example, one of the things is, what's going to happen is, if I'm going through something, or I've suffered a devastating loss, and I want to open up to one of my buddies or somebody in my life, they're almost guaranteed going to give me advice to try to fix it. So, which is going to fucking piss me off, because I don't want advice. I just want to be heard. So if you know that, like, that is a risk. So you got to take ownership over creating the conditions where you can open up with the best chance of success. So, hey man, I just really need to talk to somebody about blank. And I'd love to talk to you about it if you're up for it. And I would, if you are, I would really just like you to just listen, and please don't give me any advice. Just say that, so people know what you need.
Yeah. My daughter does that to me. She,
Yeah.
will say, sometimes she'll start talking to me and I go into problem solving mode. I'm her mum. And she'll say, stop, mum, I don't need you to solve this for me. I just need you to listen. And actually, listening is easy when you don't have to say anything. Maybe, nod and encourage and really hear what's being said. But if you don't have to solve the problem, you can really listen without thinking, oh God, how am I going to respond to this? You don't need to. You just be there.
Yeah, one of the gifts of Chloe's death, I mean, maybe you and I have talked about this, was a gift of massive humility, where I've just accepted that basically I have no idea what is best for anybody else. So I never feel the urge anymore to give people advice. I used to be a pathological advice dispenser, because I'm so friggin' smart. Like, why would you not want my advice? And then I went to, okay, I know giving advice is bad, so I'm not going to do that. But I'm having this internal conflict in my head about, Jason, shut the don't say anything. Don't. So now I'm not even present, because I'm like basically fighting with my own self. Now I'm just like, I literally don't know what's best for you. So I'm actually just super curious and present. It's very liberating, actually. So, and I think another one is, like, what you'll find is, especially when you lose someone you care about, is people will not ask very shortly after the person dies. People will just stop asking you about it for all kinds of reasons that, like, make sense to them, and I get it. But, like, so even now, if somebody says to me, "Hey, how things going, man?" Like, this doesn't happen too often, but like I connected with a friend the other day that I hadn't talked to in a while. He's like, "Hey, how's everything going?" I just say, "How honest do you want me to be?" Like, and because if you don't, like, I don't want to trauma dump on somebody's face who totally has no interest in listening to it. And if you're not up for it, fine. Like, I'm not mad about it. Like, but I'll ask, and if you're up for it, great. And if then I'll open up about it. And if not, we'll talk about something else.
I think people get terribly concerned that asking you is going to trigger something, because
Totally.
what they don't know is it's with you all the time anyway. Although there are some people who really don't want to be asked and don't want to talk, and that's true. And I find the same. Fewer and fewer of my friends ask. The ones who know me really well do. They check in, and I'll say, if I don't want to talk, I'll say, no, I'm good today. But if I'm not good, I'll say, well, if you've got 5 minutes, it'd be. And sometimes you don't even know what to talk about, do you?
Yeah.
I mean, one of my friends, who I think was one of the best supports for me over the last 6 months, she would just turn up and say, I've just popped in for a cup of tea. And we didn't, she let me talk if I wanted to. If not, she told me what was going on with her. And then she'd say, oh, come on, let's go and get some breakfast or something. Or she'd come pop in on her evening. She'll ring on her way home from work and say, just popping in. And we actually never talked deeply about what was going on, unless I was in a place where I was feeling really vulnerable and wanted to. But
Yeah.
just her presence was enough. So I think the other thing is that sometimes you don't need somebody to talk to. You just need somebody to see you
Yeah.
and to know that they see you. And that can be enough, because we do a lot of processing in our own heads, don't we? We don't want to open up. We don't want to be vulnerable. We don't want to cry. But having that person who just sort of sees you is like magic. It was really special. She was here with no agenda for herself. She was just there for me. And it was lovely, and I will value that forever. And it's taught me something as well about how can I be with somebody else as well. Because I have a friend who at the moment is going through her husband's death. He's going to die, probably in the very near future. She's been supporting him for 5 years. And I don't know what to say to her sometimes, even though I've been through something sort of similar. I don't know what to say to her to make it okay. I don't want to problem solve for her. I don't want to offer her advice. And the other day she rang me with lots of questions, and I felt so pleased. she, Otherwise, I don't know what to say. I get stuck as well, and having years and years of training. So it's okay to be stuck. It's okay not to know. And I think for other people who are not sure about asking a friend they're worried about, so they don't ask, instead they just back off and keep quiet. I think you can say to them, I really want to ask you how you are, but I'm a bit scared that I might trigger something. I don't want to make you feel bad, but I really, really want you to know that I'm just thinking about you in that way. And that's really validating as well.
Yeah, there's a technique actually. It's from Chris Voss. He's a former FBI hostage negotiator, and he wrote this book called "Never Split the Difference." And it's all about how, basically, the premise is we're constantly negotiating, like as we go throughout the day. Just whenever people have different interests or they want different things, even if it's slightly different, we're always like we're very often in a negotiation. And one of the things he talks about is the idea of an accusation audit. So it's basically saying the worst thing you think that somebody else might be thinking, but you just put it on the table. So let's say you put something on Facebook Marketplace, like a dining room table,
Yeah.
and I'll go, and you want $200 for it, and I'll say I only want to pay 100. So I'll say you'll probably think I'm like the cheapest person in the world, and then I'll just stop,
Yeah.
and you're gonna go, no, I mean that's okay, So what I'll say is, you know, to somebody, like, I'd really love to know about your experience of losing your child, but I'm worried asking about you is gonna feel like super intrusive, and I just stop, and they're gonna say either, yeah, like they're probably gonna say no, it doesn't feel intrusive at all, and then that worry is off the table,
Yes.
or they're gonna say, yeah, you know what, it would feel kind of intrusive, and I don't want to talk about it. Okay, you know.
Yeah. It's really interesting you say that, because one of the things I do professionally is train managers to look after the psychological well-being of their staff. And so many managers don't want to ask somebody, even though they might see them struggling, they
Yeah.
don't want to say, are you okay? And of course, the answer to that, it's not really an inquiry, is it? It's just a greeting. Hi, how are you? Yeah, I'm fine, thanks. Um, so we say, first of all, ask twice and ask again. And then, if you've got fears about asking, literally, as you say, lay them on the table. I'm a bit worried about asking you this. I'm a bit scared you might get cross or upset about it. I'm not sure I'm going to use the right words, and it's going to sound really clumsy. But I've just been really thinking about you, and I'm concerned about you. And
Yeah.
someone might say, no, it's fine, you've got nothing to worry about. But say, well, and then the other thing I would say, if you've got a concern, this is slightly different from just inquiring about someone's well-being. If you're inquiring because you do have a concern, say what you see. The reason I'm concerned is, you're usually so punctual, but you've been late every day this week, and that's so unlike you. Or, you're usually so, cheerful when you come into work, and you seem to me really withdrawn. So then say what you see as well, because that can really help open up a conversation. But it's so hard, isn't it? Emotions are so messy. It's so difficult.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah.
So maybe one more question is thinking about, like, you know, resilience or thriving. I mean, what's the next evolution of it? Like, what are we? If you think about resilience, what do we be teaching or maybe unteaching like 10 years from now?
Well, I've got friends. I mean, I'm a bit past having young children, but I've got friends with young children. And I love that her little boy, my friend who's got a little 4-year-old who's just started school, and they're being taught a traffic light system for feelings. So, their feelings green, amber, or red, and what might be causing those feelings. So I think improving emotional literacy for everybody, but particularly for boys and men, I think is starting. It's happening. I mean, and I've heard you talk about this. The suicide risk amongst older men is so high, much higher than it is for women, because men don't have the words or sometimes because they don't have the insight. And that sounds so rude. That's not what I mean, but you know what I mean. They don't have the language to understand what's going on inside, or why that's going on inside. So I think improving emotional literacy for boys and men, as well as for women and girls as well, is going to be the way forward. I think acknowledging that vulnerability is part of the human condition. I think we need to stop gendering our emotions and saying what's masculine and what's feminine. And of course, there's a whole other world out there, isn't there, about gender and the biology of gender and so on. And we do know that men and women's brains are formed differently, we're genetically different. But I think if in a world moving forward, we, especially in a world where we're so isolated and shut off from each other, we really need to improve our knowledge and our language around being human.
Oh, me too. It's funny. I was just talking to a good friend of mine today. Maybe he'll watch this podcast. I don't know. But he's in a really difficult situation with his wife, and they're on the cusp of splitting up. And we were literally talking on text this morning. I should read it actually. He goes, basically what he says. So he's literally on the verge of splitting up with his wife, and then he goes. Let me read it here. He goes, oh, anyways, I can't find the text, but basically he was saying, like he was trying to convince me he doesn't feel overly emotional about it. And I'm like, you're what? Like, I said, if you are literally trying to tell me that you don't feel overly emotional about the fact that your 20-year marriage is on the verge of collapse, you need to ask yourself how that belief has contributed to you actually getting to this situation, dude. Because if you actually believe that, I won't say what I called him, but let's just say it's something guys call themselves. Like, it was not a nice name, but like if you actually think that, you're a fucking idiot, basically, right? Like, come on, man. Like, Jesus, So, it's super, and I totally understand why he's doing it. It is 100% a method of control, right? Like, I'm just gonna lock this box down and pretend that I'm okay, and like I got to keep a lid on things, and yeah, but man, like it.
Well, he's so lucky to have a friend that will say it how they see it as well.
Yeah, I don't know if he feels lucky right now, because when I popped up my text, I see this long. So he may have just like gone on a long rant about telling me to go to hell. But yeah, I mean, we all have blind spots, man. We all need people in our lives that care about us too.
We do, and the people who care about us most, I think, are the ones who are prepared to say it how they see it. I'm not saying that other people might be right and we're wrong, and I never believe in the truth. We have versions of the truth. I have my truth, you have your truth. They might not agree, but to have a friend, always for me, to have a critical friend, the friend who's not afraid to say, is that really why you're doing that, or is that really how you're feeling? I think is like gold. And that's why our networks are so important as well. We don't want to live in an echo chamber. I want friends who will challenge me, who will question what I'm doing, who will make me stop and think, because that's how we grow. And that goes back to this part about, as resilience. It's not just about bouncing back, it's about learning. And it's about doing things differently next time, because that might have a better outcome, or a more peaceful outcome, or a gentler outcome.
Yeah. All right. Well, hey, I agree. And before I ask you, what I would love to do is just thinking about, a guy who's, again, maybe suffered a devastating loss or really in a difficult situation. I'd love to hear just maybe like, one or two or three important things that you really think that they should know about resilience. And then before I let you do that, I'm just going to say to the guys listening, also on the emotional literacy part, there are other emotions other than anger that you experience. Like, trust me, okay? And emotional literacy is actually like understanding that. Okay, over to you.
The first thing I think I'd want to say is be kind to yourself. This is not a psychological theory that's been tested, but I imagine, we use the language, have a word with yourself, stop beating yourself up, give yourself a good talking to. So there's you and there's yourself. And I think ourselves are full of gremlins that have a lot of fun. Do you remember the film Gremlins?
I do remember the film Gremlins, yeah.
And when they got wet, they became yeah. So I think imagine yourself as like a load of gremlins. It's like really creative and fun and lovely, and and good storytellers and everything else. But when they get wet, in other words, when something really difficult happens, they become these nasty little peckers. So there's you and yourself. And sometimes yourself gets so big, it can consume you and you feel out of control because you are the kind of like adult, the parent, if you like. So, so we need ourselves and we need us to be sort of like the same size. So I can have a word with myself, but I can also listen to what myself is telling me. And if my self-talk is nasty and vicious, and like you're crap and you're useless and you're worthless and you're vulnerable, is to try and engage you to say, now hang on a minute, don't speak to me like that, because we speak in our head in ways we'd never speak to our friends or the people that we love. So the first thing I say to anyone actually who's really struggling, not just men, but to men with grief, is please listen to your self-talk and be kind. If this was your son coming to you with a problem, what would you say? If this was your best friend or your dad, and please don't say, "Oh, for God's sake, just man up and get on with it," because it's really, really unhelpful. But so be kind. That's the first thing.
Hey, on that, Joe, I wanted to say one of the things I heard somebody say, and I cannot remember where I heard it. I think it was from like Peter Attia, who's a medical doctor who has a podcast, but he goes, he had a lot of issues with like just brutal like self-talk, which drove him to be like this crazy overachiever guy, but like a tortured, like no sense of peace. And he said his therapist told him to one of the ways of dealing that is to actually personify your inner narrative by giving them a name. So I think he gave his inner voice a name, Richard, which shortens to Dick.
Nice. Yeah. There's a brilliant therapeutic technique that I only know a little bit about called IFS. I think it's called integrated family systems, but it talks about you having parts. And about which part is dominant and sort of taking over, and maybe you could have a word with that part and say what would happen if that part of you was quiet, and let the other parts of you have a say. So, but I think the idea of just being a little bit more compassionate and a little more gentle would be the first thing. Even though I've been going on about not gendering emotions, courage is often courage isn't gendered. I think courage applies to us all. Be courageous, and that might mean facing your demons and asking for help. That takes an enormous amount of courage. We've got time for this, Jason. It just reminded me of a training course I was doing, and we were talking about the continuum of psychological well-being, and got people to stand where they were, whether they were like 0 as in awful, which you didn't expect anyone at work to be, and 100 as in top notch. And this chap put himself at about 30, and then we asked the question, "Where were you 6 months ago?" And everybody moved except him. He stayed there about 30. So I said to him, "Have you moved at all in the 6 months, or have you just been feeling grim for 6 months?" And he was a senior manager in a room with some line reports and more junior staff, all managers, but more junior staff. And he stood there and he said, "Actually," he said, "nobody really knows this, but I have been feeling pretty grim for the last 6 months." And the courage it took for him to do that, but that was his opportunity and he did it. And as a result of that, we went into a coaching relationship for another 6 months-ish. And he found his way out of the hole that he felt he was in because of that courage. And so I'd say, I'll give him a name. Let's give him a name. We'll call him Tom. That's not his name, but we'll call him Tom. Be like Tom. He was a man in his 50s, very successful in his career, but he had been really struggling and he'd not told anyone. And he took that moment to disclose it. And I have so much admiration for him, and so did everyone else in the room. So, be like Tom, have that courage, take that step, ask for help. That would be, and that can make you feel it can make you feel strong. Being courageous can make you feel strong. And if that's what you need, be courageous. Be strong in that way, to take that step. And I think the third thing is the voices in your head will tell you what everyone else is going to think, but they know nothing. So do not believe what the voices in your head are telling you about what everyone else is going to think. because the chances are people will be delighted to be able to help you and support you. They'll want to do that. The people who love you will want to do that for you, but you have to let them.
I love it. I love it.
Yeah.
Joe, you killed it. Come
Oh,
on. This was great.
I've loved it. It's been so nice. Thanks so much, Jason. It's been lovely to talk with you. And thank you for all you've done for members of my chosen family as well. I've been so grateful.
Yeah, wonderful. It's a pleasure and a privilege. So, all right. Well, maybe just if anybody wants to learn, so we'll put. You mentioned a number of books and stuff, so we'll grab those and we'll put them in the show notes. But if people want to learn more about you, is there a way for them to do that?
Well, our new website went live yesterday. It's petros.org.uk. We do work internationally. We're a little non-profit business, family non-profit business. My daughter works for me, which is delightful. And we do work internationally in the field of resilience and wellbeing organisationally. My heart is with our public services that put staff in the front line of trauma, like policing, prisons, health, social work. So there's lots of stuff on our website, lots of resources and blogs and things for people to read. And if you want any training, come and ask us.
All right, wonderful.
Thank
Well,
you.
Joe, thanks so much for doing this. Thanks so much for the contribution you're making to the world, and thanks for being my friend. I'm really grateful that we got the chance to get to know each other.
And I really hope we get to meet in person soon.
Yeah, I'm sure we will. All right, Joe, thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye, Jason.
See you later.